The fork stopped midair, suspended in a moment that would later feel prophetic. Leonard Kalin sat at his usual corner table in Riva Alta, where amber light caught the rim of his wine glass and transformed it into liquid gold. The restaurant hummed with carefully orchestrated wealth, low conversations, crystal clinking against porcelain, linen napkins whispering against expensive fabric. His lieutenants flanked him like sculptures of obedience, discussing shipment routes in voices that never rose above murmurs. Then the door opened, and cold mountain air swept through the entrance like an uninvited ghost. The hostess moved to intercept, her practiced smile already forming, but something made her hesitate. A child stood in the doorway, small enough that the brass handle seemed enormous in comparison, yet possessing a stillness that contradicted her size. Nela Calveni walked forward with the precision of someone following an invisible line. Her dress was clean but worn thin at the seams, her shoes scuffed at the toes from long walks on concrete. Every head turned as she passed, conversations fracturing mid-sentence, because children did not enter Riva Alta alone. The servers exchanged glances, but made no move to stop her. Something in her trajectory suggested interference would be futile. She navigated between tables without touching a single chair, her gaze locked on the corner where power consolidated itself. Lenor's lieutenants straightened in their seats, hands moving toward concealed weapons with practiced subtlety. But he raised one finger in a gesture so slight it might have been mistaken for adjusting his cuff. The movement froze every protective instinct in the room, creating a pocket of stillness that expanded outward. The child reached his table and stopped, her small hand extending to grip the fabric of his shirt just above his heart. Her fingers closed on the expensive material with surprising strength, wrinkling Italian silk that cost more than most people earned in a month. She tilted her head back to meet his eyes, and in that gaze Leonard saw something he rarely encountered: absolute conviction without fear. The restaurant held its collective breath, waiting for his response to this unprecedented violation of space and protocol. Tasting forks remained suspended, wine glasses halfway to lips, as if the entire room had been caught in amber. "Your bodyguard beat my mom," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hand. "She won't go home." 4 words that carried the weight of accusation and plea simultaneously, delivered with the simplicity of someone too young to understand the danger of truth. The silence that followed pressed against eardrums like a physical force, heavy enough to crack the carefully maintained veneer of civilized dining. Leonard studied her face with the same attention he gave to contracts worth millions. He noted the faint shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the set of her jaw that revealed genetic stubbornness. This was not a child prone to dramatics or lies. This was survival manifesting as courage because no other option remained. Her grip on his shirt never wavered, as if she understood that releasing him meant losing the only chance she would ever have. "Who is your mother?" His voice emerged quiet, almost gentle, but it carried to every corner of the room. The question was not a challenge, but an opening, the first step in a calculation already forming behind his carefully neutral expression. "The woman who fixes violins on the street near the train station." Her answer came immediately, without hesitation, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Leonard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that his lieutenants recognized as the prelude to consequence. He gestured to the man on his left with 2 fingers, a silent command that required no translation in the language of their world. The lieutenant rose from his seat and disappeared through a side door, his footsteps the only sound in the frozen tableau. Nella's hand remained fisted in Leonard's shirt, her knuckles white with the effort of holding on, while he sat motionless as carved stone, waiting for information that would determine what happened next in this impossible interruption. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, measured only by the shallow breathing of a child who refused to let go. The other diners pretended to resume their meals, but every fork moved with mechanical precision. Every sip of wine tasted like cardboard. Leonard reached for his water glass with his free hand and pushed it across the white tablecloth toward Nella. "Drink," he said, not as an order, but as an observation of her cracked lips and the dust on her shoes that suggested she had walked a long distance. She picked up the glass without releasing his shirt, bringing it to her mouth with both hands like a much younger child. Water spilled slightly down her chin, but she drank deeply, her throat working in desperate swallows that revealed how long she had been searching for him. When she set the glass down, their eyes met again, and something passed between them that had no name. It was not sympathy or compassion. Those were luxuries Leonard had discarded years ago, but rather a recognition of will meeting will, of two people who understood that retreat was never an option. The side door opened, and the lieutenant returned, moving with the controlled urgency of someone carrying information that could not wait. He leaned down, his mouth close to Leonard's ear, and whispered words that made the muscles in the boss's jaw flex with barely contained reaction. Leonard's expression remained carved from marble, but something shifted behind his eyes like tectonic plates adjusting beneath calm water. He looked down at Nella's small fist still gripping his shirt, then back up at the lieutenant with a gaze that could have frozen blood. Confirmed? The single word carried enough weight to crush bones, and the lieutenant nodded once, his face pale despite his dark complexion. Warren took her 3 days ago. Said she saw something during the shipment transfer near the industrial zone. The lieutenant's voice dropped even lower, as if speaking the words too loudly might invoke something dangerous. She's been held in the abandoned warehouse on Fisher Street, the one we use for temporary storage. He claimed she needed to be convinced not to talk. Lenor's free hand curled into a fist on the table, his knuckles going white against the dark wood. Warren was one of his outer circle, a bodyguard with authority to protect operations, but never to act without explicit orders involving civilians. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to drain away entirely, as if someone had turned down the volume on reality itself. Lenor's breathing remained steady, but those who knew him recognized the stillness that preceded volcanic eruption, not of heat, but of ice that burned deeper than any flame. Was there something to see? His question came soft as silk and sharp as a razor's edge, each word precisely enunciated. The lieutenant shook his head quickly, fear making his movements jerky despite his training. No, sir. Warren was conducting personal business on company time, trying to shake down the luthier shops for protection money without authorization. He used my name. It was not a question, and the lieutenant's silence confirmed what Leonard already knew, that someone wearing his authority like stolen clothing had created this situation, had brought this child to his table with accusations that carried the terrible weight of truth. Leonard stood slowly, the movement causing Nella to stumble slightly but not release her grip on his shirt. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she had entered, something almost human flickered across his features. Not kindness, but something more complex, a recognition of debt incurred through another's error. Take me to her. Nella's voice came small but firm, and Leonard realized she had not just come to accuse but to lead, to ensure that words translated into action. He nodded once, a gesture that sent ripples of shock through every observer in the room. Leonard Kalin did not follow children, did not allow anyone to dictate his movements. Yet here he was, allowing this small hand to guide him toward the door like a compass pointing toward something he could no longer avoid. The night air hit them like a wall of ice as they stepped outside Riva Alta, the contrast with the restaurant's warmth sharp enough to steal breath. Nella finally released Lenor's shirt, but she stayed close to his side, her small frame casting almost no shadow beneath the amber streetlights. 2 black cars materialized at the curb, as if summoned by thought alone, their engines purring with expensive precision. Leonard's remaining lieutenants emerged from the restaurant behind them, forming a protective semicircle that spoke of trained efficiency and unquestioned loyalty. He opened the rear door of the first car himself, a gesture so unexpected that his men exchanged quick glances. "Get in," he told Nella, and she climbed into the leather interior without hesitation, sliding across the seat to make room for him. The car pulled away from the curb with the second vehicle following close behind, heading toward Boulder's industrial district where legitimate business dissolved into shadow. Nella sat with her hands folded in her lap, her small body rigid with tension that had nothing to do with fear of the man beside her. "How did you know where to find me?" Leonard asked, his voice neutral, genuinely curious about the mechanics of this impossible intersection. "I asked people in the street where the man in charge goes to eat." Her answer came simple and direct, revealing a logic that was both childlike and terrifyingly practical. "I waited outside for 3 nights until I saw your car. Tonight I had enough courage to go in." Leonard absorbed this information in silence, processing the image of this small girl conducting surveillance with the patience of a trained operative. The streetlights painted moving patterns across her face as they drove, illuminating features that bore striking resemblance to someone he suddenly needed to see. The city changed around them, elegant storefronts giving way to chain-link fences and corrugated metal. The Flatirons loomed dark against the star-scattered sky, their massive presence a reminder that human concerns were temporary against the permanence of stone. Fisher Street appeared like a scar across the landscape, lined with warehouses that had seen better decades and now served purposes their original architects never imagined. The cars slowed, their headlights catching graffiti and broken windows, until they stopped before a building that looked abandoned, but wasn't. 2 men stood outside the rolling door, their postures shifting from casual to alert as they recognized the vehicles. Leonard emerged from the car before it fully stopped, Nella scrambling out behind him with determination that bordered on desperation. "Open it!" The command carried across the cold air with perfect clarity, and the guards moved to comply without question or delay. The metal door rolled upward with a grinding shriek that echoed off surrounding buildings, revealing darkness punctuated by a single hanging bulb. The light swung slightly in the draft created by the opening door, casting moving shadows that made the interior seem to breathe. Leonard stepped inside, and the temperature dropped further, the warehouse absorbing cold and holding it like a living thing. His eyes adjusted quickly, taking in the scattered wooden crates, the smell of motor oil and something else, fear, sharp and acrid. Nella pushed past him with sudden urgency, running toward the back corner where the darkness gathered most densely. Her footsteps echoed on concrete, small and frantic, until they stopped abruptly at a shape huddled against the far wall. "Mom!" The word tore from her throat with enough force to crack, and Leonard watched as the shape moved, becoming human, becoming a woman who raised her head with obvious effort. Fiona Calvini sat with her back against rough brick, her wrists showing marks that told their own story of restraint recently removed. Her face carried bruises in various stages of healing, purple and yellow and green, a timeline of violence mapped across delicate features. But her eyes, when they fixed on her daughter, then shifted to the man silhouetted in the doorway, held something that made Leonard pause. Not gratitude, not relief, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she had always known this moment would arrive in some form, had been waiting for the consequence of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a city where power operated by rules most people never saw. Leonard moved forward with measured steps, his presence filling the warehouse like water flooding into empty space. His lieutenants fanned out behind him, their faces carved from stone, as they took in the scene that represented a catastrophic failure of protocol. Fiona pushed herself upward along the wall, her movements slow and careful, as if testing which parts of her body still functioned properly. Nella wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, pressing her face against fabric that smelled of sweat and concrete dust, and days without sunlight, cut her loose completely. Leonard's words fell into the silence like stones dropped into deep water, and one of his men produced a knife that gleamed under the swinging bulb. But Fiona raised a hand, stopping the approach. "Already done," she said, her voice rough from disuse but steady underneath. "Your men cut the ropes when they heard the cars. I've been sitting here trying to remember how to stand." The statement carried no accusation, only fact delivered with the precision of someone who understood that emotion was a luxury she could not yet afford. She finally managed to straighten fully, one hand braced against the wall, the other resting on her daughter's head. Leonard studied her with the same intensity he had given Nella, cataloging details that told a story beyond the visible bruises. Her hands showed calluses in specific patterns, not from manual labor but from skilled work requiring precision. The way she held herself suggested discipline, perhaps dance training or martial arts, something that taught the body to move with intention even when broken. Fiona Calvini. He spoke her name as a statement, not a question, and she nodded once in confirmation. "The luthier who works on Maple Street, above the bookstore with the green awning." Her response contained more information than necessary, establishing location and legitimacy, proving she was not invisible even if she had been treated as such. Leonard's jaw tightened fractionally. "Warren claimed you witnessed a shipment transfer, that you needed to be silenced before you talked to authorities who would never have believed you anyway. I witnessed him stealing from a delivery truck behind the music shop at 2 a.m. Fiona's correction came quiet but firm, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that truth was her only weapon. He was taking boxes that didn't belong to him, marking them as damaged when they were perfectly intact. When he saw me closing up the workshop, he decided I was a problem that needed containing. The explanation shifted the entire framework of the situation from operational security to common theft. Warren had not been protecting Leonard's interests, but covering his own criminal enterprise conducted under borrowed authority. "How long?" Leonard asked, and Fiona understood he was not asking about her captivity, but about Warren's operation. Based on the quantity he was moving, months, maybe longer. She paused, then added with deliberate precision, "He told me you had ordered my silence, that speaking would endanger my daughter more than staying quiet ever could. The manipulation was elegant in its cruelty, using Leonard's reputation as a weapon without his knowledge or consent. Warren had created a perfect trap, one that relied on fear of power rather than power itself, and in doing so had made Leonard complicit in violence he never authorized. He was wrong. The two words emerged from Leonard like a verdict, final and absolute, carrying weight that made the temperature in the warehouse seem to drop further. Fiona met his gaze directly, and something passed between them that Nella was too young to understand, a recognition of mutual position in a world that operated by unwritten rules. She saw that he meant what he said, but also that his word only mattered because someone had violated it first. My daughter shouldn't have had to find you to make that true. Her statement was not quite accusation, not quite observation, but something that lived in the space between, an acknowledgement that systems built on fear created their own problems. Leonard absorbed this without visible reaction. Though his lieutenants shifted uncomfortably at hearing their boss addressed with such directness, he turned to the man on his right, the one who had first brought him information inside the restaurant. Bring Warren here, now, and find out who else knew. The command carried implications that needed no elaboration, instructions that would be followed with the efficiency of long practice. The lieutenant disappeared into the night, his footsteps fading beyond the open warehouse door, where cold air continued to pour inside like an uninvited guest. Leonard removed his jacket with economical movements and held it toward Fiona, the expensive fabric suddenly irrelevant compared to her visible shivering. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, wrapping the coat around her shoulders with a gratitude that remained unspoken. The gesture was practical rather than kind, but it shifted something in the atmosphere, made the space feel fractionally less hostile. There's a car outside. It will take you wherever you need to go. Leonard's tone suggested this was not negotiable, though phrased as information rather than command. Nella looked up at her mother, then back at Leonard, her expression uncertain for the first time since entering the restaurant. What happens to the man who hurt her? The question emerged small but clear, a child's need for justice expressed in the simplest possible terms. Leonard crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with her, a movement that caused visible tension in his remaining guards. He will answer for what he did, but you don't need to see that. Some things are better left to people who understand consequences. His words carried no threat, no promise of violence, yet they communicated certainty that Nella seemed to accept. She nodded slowly, then took her mother's hand with both of hers, holding on as if afraid Fiona might disappear again. Fiona's gaze remained on Lenor's face, searching for something beneath the careful neutrality. Will answering include why he thought he could use your name as permission? Or is this just about theft? The question demonstrated an understanding of organizational structure that surprised him, suggesting she saw more than most civilians ever did. Lenor rose to his full height, considering how much truth to offer someone who had already paid too high a price for accidental knowledge. It includes everything. His answer was economical but complete, a commitment to comprehensive correction rather than surface resolution. Warren's actions suggest a rot that goes deeper than one man's greed. That rot ends tonight, along with anyone who helped it spread. Fiona studied him with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been calculation, perhaps both. And tomorrow, when word spreads that a luthier brought the man in charge to his knees with a child's accusation? The observation was sharp enough to draw blood, pointing to a vulnerability Leonard had not fully considered in the moment of Nella's arrival. His reputation was built on invulnerability, on the illusion that nothing touched him without permission. Yet here stood evidence that a 7-year-old had breached every defense he possessed. Tomorrow people will know that my word means something beyond fear. He spoke with conviction that felt true, even as he invented it, turning potential weakness into statement of principle. That there are lines even I don't permit crossing, and that includes violence against those who pose no actual threat. One of his lieutenants made a soft sound that might have been surprise or disagreement, quickly stifled. The philosophy Leonard was articulating existed in direct contradiction to standard operational procedure, where witnesses were liabilities and loose ends were severed without sentiment. Fiona tilted her head slightly, weighing his words against lived experience. Pretty ideals from a man who makes his living on controlled violence, but I suppose even criminals need codes, or everything becomes chaos. Her tone carried no judgment, only observation delivered with the detachment of someone who had spent 3 days contemplating the nature of power. Leonard found himself unexpectedly impressed by her refusal to perform gratitude or terror, her insistence on maintaining dignity, even while wearing his jacket over torn clothing. Codes are what separate us from Warren. The admission emerged before he could calculate its wisdom, revealing more philosophy than he typically shared with anyone outside his innermost circle. Without them, we're just predators fighting over territory. With them, we're something closer to governance, even if the law refuses to acknowledge it. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside interrupted whatever response Fiona might have offered. Car doors opened and closed with efficient precision, followed by the heavier sound of someone being moved without cooperation. Lenore's expression hardened into something that made even his own men take an involuntary step backward. Take them to the car, make sure the driver knows where they live, and that he watches until they're safely inside. The lieutenant nearest the door gestured for Fiona and Nella to follow him, his posture more escort than guard. Fiona moved toward the exit with careful steps. Nella pressed against her side, but she paused at the threshold. The warehouse filled with new bodies, men dragging a figure between them whose face showed the beginning of consequences already delivered. Warren's lip was split, his eyes swelling, but these injuries were preliminary, the kind inflicted during transport rather than interrogation. Lenore did not watch Fiona and Nella leave, keeping his attention fixed on the man being forced to his knees on concrete. The contrast between his stillness and Warren's agitation spoke volumes about which position held more power in this moment. "Do you know why you're here?" Lenore's question emerged soft, almost conversational, more dangerous than any shout could have been. Warren's eyes darted around the warehouse, looking for escape or explanation, finding neither. "Boss, I can explain. The woman, she was going to talk. I was protecting our interests. By stealing from cargo that wasn't yours to touch, by invoking authority you don't possess, by holding a civilian for days without clearance or cause." Each question landed like a physical blow, systematic dismantling of every excuse before it could fully form. The other men in the warehouse stood silent, bearing witness to accountability that reinforced every lesson about operational boundaries. This was not just about Warren's punishment, but about preventing the next person from believing they could act without consequences. Warren's face shifted through calculations visible enough to be embarrassing, weighing lies against truth, defiance against surrender. "She saw me, boss. I couldn't just let her walk away knowing you were a thief?" Lenore's interruption was surgical. "Not that you were protecting my shipments, but that you were robbing them. That's what she witnessed, Warren. Your personal criminal enterprise conducted under my protection." The distinction mattered, separating organizational necessity from individual corruption. Warren's breathing grew ragged as he realized his defense had become his indictment, that every word confirmed rather than excused his actions. "The problem isn't that you made a mistake." Lenore circled slowly, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls. "The problem is you made it in my name. You told that woman I ordered her silence. You made her daughter believe I authorized violence against her mother." Warren's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. What defense existed against such precise articulation of offense? He had not merely stolen or acted without permission. He had counterfeited authority itself, the one currency that mattered more than money in their world. How many others? The question came from one of the lieutenants, breaking the established pattern of Lenore's sole interrogation. But Lenore nodded permission for the inquiry, curious himself about the scope of contamination. Warren's silence provided answer enough, guilt readable in every line of his body. 3 weeks passed, like water flowing around stone, reshaping the landscape without announcing its progress. Lenore returned to his routines at Riva Alta, the restaurant absorbing the memory of interruption and smoothing over the rough edges until everything appeared normal again. But the story had escaped containment, spreading through networks that trafficked in information as valuable as any commodity. People whispered about the child who had walked into power without fear, about the boss who had responded to accusation with investigation rather than elimination. The narrative shifted his reputation in ways both useful and dangerous, painting him as someone with principles beyond profit. Some saw this as strength, evidence of control so complete it could afford mercy. Others saw vulnerability, proof that the right leverage could bend even the unbendable. Lenore absorbed these reactions without visible concern, adjusting strategies to account for perception shifts. He increased security protocols while loosening operational restrictions, demonstrating that accountability flowed both directions: protection for loyalty, consequences for betrayal. On a Thursday afternoon, when sunlight slanted through Riva Alta's windows at angles that made the glassware glow, the hostess approached his table with unusual hesitation. "Sir, there's a woman asking to see you. She says you'll remember her. He looked up from documents that required his signature, already knowing who stood waiting. Send her in. Fiona entered alone, moving with restored grace that spoke of healing both physical and psychological. She carried something wrapped in dark cloth, holding it with the care of someone transporting something precious and fragile. The restaurant noticed, but did not react, diners having learned that unusual events at Leonard's table were to be observed peripherally, never directly. She stopped at the customary distance, neither too close nor too far, respecting boundaries while refusing to be diminished by them. I brought something that belongs to you. She placed the wrapped object on the table, her movements precise and deliberate. Leonard gestured for her to sit, a courtesy he rarely extended to unexpected visitors. She accepted, settling into the chair across from him with straight-backed composure that reminded him of her daughter's fearless approach weeks earlier. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing an instrument bow restored to pristine condition. The wood glowed with new finish, the horsehair tight and perfect, every component showing the kind of attention that transformed function into art. Warren had it. Fiona's explanation came quiet, but clear. He took it from my workshop the night he grabbed me, probably thought it was valuable. Your men found it when they cleaned out his apartment. Leonard turned the bow in his hands, feeling the balance that spoke of craftsmanship beyond mere functionality. The restoration had required hours of patient work, each detail attended to with a precision that matched his own approach to operations that required invisible perfection. You came to return stolen property. His statement invited elaboration, recognized that the gesture carried meaning beyond simple logistics. Fiona met his gaze without flinching, her green eyes steady in the afternoon light. I came to see if the man who ordered my release is the same one who built the system that allowed my capture. The accusation landed softly but unmistakably, a philosophical challenge wrapped in practical observation. She was testing whether his intervention had been aberration or principle, whether she owed gratitude or merely acknowledged a temporary alignment of interests. They're the same man. Lenore set the bow down carefully, giving the admission weight through deliberate placement. But only one of them makes decisions. The other just exists in the space those decisions create. Fiona tilted her head slightly, processing the distinction between active choice and passive circumstance. That sounds like philosophy designed to let you sleep at night. Does it work? Her directness would have gotten most people removed from his presence, but Leonard found himself appreciating the refusal to perform deference. She spoke to him as an equal in conversation, if not in power, treating their interaction as negotiation rather than supplication. Some nights better than others. The honesty surprised him even as he spoke it, revealing more than strategic calculation suggested was wise. The night your daughter walked into this restaurant, I slept worse than I had in years. Not from guilt, but from understanding how close the system came to permanent failure. Fiona absorbed this with an expression that suggested she was cataloging information for later analysis. Warren's gone. Your men won't say where, but absence speaks loudly enough. How many others disappeared with him? The question demonstrated awareness of organizational cleaning that extended beyond individual punishment. She understood that corruption metastasized, required excision of surrounding tissue to prevent recurrence, and wanted to know the scope of consequences her survival had triggered. 4 more. Leonard's answer came without hesitation, a number she deserved to know given that her witnessing had initiated the purge. 3 who knew and said nothing. 1 who actively helped Warren move stolen goods through false documentation. Fiona's hands tightened slightly on the table edge, the only visible reaction to confirmation that 5 lives had ended because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's a high price for watching someone steal boxes in an alley. The price wasn't for watching. Leonard leaned forward fractionally, his voice dropping to a register meant only for her. It was for the lie Warren told after. He made you a symbol of something I can't permit, the belief that my authority can be borrowed without consequence. The explanation reframed her captivity as symptom rather than cause, transformed her from victim into catalyst for correction that would have eventually become necessary regardless. Fiona seemed to understand this, her expression shifting from defensive to contemplative. So I should feel grateful that my suffering served a greater purpose in your organizational structure? The edge in her voice was sharp enough to draw blood, but it lacked the heat of genuine anger. This was testing boundaries, probing to see where his justification ended and her autonomy began. Leonard sat back, recognizing the trap implicit in any answer that suggested she owed him anything. You should feel whatever you feel. Gratitude isn't currency I trade in. You survived something you shouldn't have faced, and your daughter was brave enough to find me when courage mattered more than caution. The acknowledgement of Nella shifted something in Fiona's posture, softening the defensive tension that had kept her spine rigid. She hasn't stopped talking about you. Asks every day if the man from the restaurant is making sure we're safe. The revelation carried implications Lenner immediately recognized. A 7-year-old's attachment to someone who represented protection could become liability or leverage depending on who learned of it. Is she right to ask? Do you feel safe? Fiona considered the question with visible seriousness, weighing lived experience against recent interventions. Your men watch our building. Not obviously, but I notice patterns. The same cars at different times, faces that appear too frequently to be coincidence. So yes, safer than before. But safety provided by the same power that endangered me feels precarious. Her analysis was uncomfortably accurate, pointing to the fundamental paradox of his protection, that it was simultaneously shield and potential weapon. Lenore respected her refusal to pretend comfort where calculation existed, her insistence on naming the dynamics most people preferred to ignore. The afternoon light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, painting the restaurant interior in alternating brightness and shadow. A server approached with fresh water, reading the tension at the table with trained precision, retreating without offering menus or interruption. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken negotiations about trust and terms. Lenore noticed details he had missed during their first encounter in the warehouse, the silver chain at her neck disappearing beneath her collar, the precise way she held her hands when not actively gesturing, suggesting control born from years of detailed work. Her profession had shaped her the way his had shaped him, creating discipline that manifested differently, but derived from the same source, understanding that small mistakes carried large consequences. Your daughter mentioned you play violin yourself. The observation was calculated to shift conversation away from philosophy toward something more concrete and less fraught with implicit accusation, that you were teaching her before everything happened. Precarious is honest. He picked up the bow again, running his thumb along the perfectly restored curve. Most safety is. The difference is whether you know who holds the strings or pretend they don't exist. Fiona watched his handling of the instrument with professional interest, noting his care despite obvious unfamiliarity with its purpose. You're not a musician. Why does that matter to you? Because you made it matter by bringing it here. Lenore set the bow down with finality. Everything that crosses this table carries meaning. You chose this as your message. Craftsmanship restored from damage. I'm curious what you want me to understand from it. Fiona's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but suggested appreciation for his reading of subtext. I want you to understand that broken things can be fixed if someone with the right skills decides they're worth saving. Not as they were, but as something that works again. The metaphor was transparent enough to be deliberate. She was speaking about herself, about systems, about the possibility of repair without erasure of damage. Lenore absorbed the message, recognizing both its wisdom and its implicit challenge to his usual methods of problem resolution. I don't fix things. His response came flat and definitive. I replace them or remove them. Fixing requires patience I've never cultivated and faith in transformation I've never possessed. Fiona leaned forward slightly, her intensity matching his in different frequency. Then maybe you should learn, because your replacement solution almost killed someone whose only crime was closing up her workshop at the wrong hour. The accusation was fair enough that Lenner couldn't deflect it, so he absorbed it instead, letting the weight settle into calculations about how he structured authority and accountability. She was right. His system optimized for efficiency over precision, for elimination over rehabilitation. If I wanted to learn, he said carefully, testing words before committing to them, where would someone teach that particular skill, metaphorically speaking? Fiona studied him for a long moment, searching for mockery or manipulation, apparently finding neither. I opened a new workshop, near the river, past the old mill on Arapahoe. I restore instruments that most people think are beyond saving. Water damage, fire damage, decades of neglect. The information was offered casually, but Lenner recognized the invitation hidden within practical details. She was telling him where to find her, establishing that his presence would be interpreted as genuine interest, rather than surveillance or threat. Instruments. He repeated the word as if testing its weight, not metaphors for organizational reform, actual violins and cellos and things with strings. Her laugh emerged unexpected and genuine, brightening her features in a way that reminded him she was younger than the past weeks had made her seem. Actual instruments. though I won't stop you from drawing whatever philosophical conclusions you need while watching wood grain get sanded." The moment felt oddly normal, two people discussing craft and location, as if their introduction hadn't involved kidnapping and accusation. Leonard found himself uncertain how to navigate conversation that didn't involve negotiation or threat, this strange territory where words served no purpose beyond communication. "Your daughter." He shifted topics to ground that felt more familiar. "She goes to school near there? The elementary on Baseline?" Fiona's expression sharpened immediately, maternal protection activating at the mention of Nella, in context of his knowledge. "She does. Why do you ask?" "Because children who demonstrate that kind of courage deserve to grow up without looking over their shoulders." Lenore kept his tone neutral, factual. "I wanted to make sure the protection extends to the places she actually spends time, not just the building where she sleeps." The explanation seemed to satisfy something in Fiona's assessment, her shoulders dropping fractionally from defensive height. "Your men already know her route. They've been following it for 2 weeks, always far enough back that she doesn't notice, but close enough to intervene if necessary. Her awareness of his surveillance network shouldn't have surprised him. She had already demonstrated observational skills sharper than most civilians possessed. Does that bother you, knowing we watch?" A couple at a nearby table laughed at something private, the sound jarring against the weight of their conversation. Fiona glanced toward the noise, then back to Leonard, as if measuring the distance between normal life and the one she currently inhabited. The restaurant existed in both worlds simultaneously, a place where ordinary people celebrated anniversaries while transactions that determined the city's hidden architecture happened 3 tables away. "I teach her to notice patterns now," Fiona said quietly, returning to his question about Nella's awareness. "Not to make her paranoid, but to give her tools I never had. She knows which cars belong in our neighborhood, which faces appear too frequently, how to recognize when someone is watching versus when someone is hunting." The admission revealed parenting philosophy shaped by trauma, a mother preparing her child for a world that had already proven dangerous. Lenore understood this instinct. His own father had taught him similar lessons, though the threats they'd faced came from different sources and required different defenses. Fiona considered the question with the same seriousness she'd given his earlier inquiries about safety. "It bothers me that it's necessary, but given that it is, I prefer competent watchers to the alternative. Your men are professionals. They don't make her feel hunted." The compliment was backhanded but sincere, acknowledging expertise while regretting its requirement. Leonard appreciated the complexity of her position, the way she refused to collapse into simple gratitude or resentment, maintaining nuance that reflected the actual mess of their situation. "The workshop." He returned to safer ground. "You said near the river. Is it the building with the green door, the one that used to be a print shop?" Fiona's surprise showed clearly, her eyebrows rising slightly. "You know it? That specific building? I know every building in this city that changes hands or purpose." The admission revealed more about his operational thoroughness than he typically shared. "Old print shop, vacant for 18 months, purchased 3 weeks ago through an LLC that took some effort to trace back to you." Her expression cycled through several emotions, impressed, unsettled, resigned, before settling on pragmatic acceptance. "Of course you know. Why would I expect privacy from someone whose business is knowing everything? There's a difference between knowing and caring." Leonard's distinction was subtle, but significant. "I know because information is collected. I care because you made yourself relevant by surviving and then by showing up here with that bow." Fiona absorbed the statement, parsing it for threat or reassurance, apparently finding elements of both. Relevant. That's one way to describe being caught in your organization's crossfire and living to discuss it. Most people don't live to discuss it. His response emerged colder than intended, stating fact without considering how it would sound. The ones who do usually want something: money, protection, leverage. You came back to return property and ask if I'm the villain or just playing one. That makes you either very brave or very foolish. Fiona stood slowly, the movement signaling conclusion, without requiring announcement. Maybe both. Bravery and foolishness look similar when you're the one taking the risk, but I came for another reason too, when I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to voice. Leonard remained seated, giving her the positional advantage of height, curious where this conversation would ultimately land. "Say it then. You've earned the right to speak freely at this table." She took a breath, steadying herself for words that clearly carried weight. "I wanted to see if you were someone who could learn from mistakes, or just someone who punished them. Because Nella asks about you, and I need to know whether to encourage that interest or crush it for her protection." The statement hit harder than accusations or demands would have, pointing to a responsibility Leonard had never asked for, but couldn't deny accepting. "I don't know how to be someone a child should admire. That's not a skill my life has required developing." Fiona's smile carried sadness mixed with something that might have been understanding. "Neither did I, until I had one. But here's what I've learned. Children don't need perfection. They need honesty about imperfection, and evidence that adults can grow. You did that, even if you didn't mean to." She picked up the bow from the table, but instead of taking it, she held it out to him. "Keep this. Not as payment or symbol or anything transactional. Keep it because instruments need to be used or they forget their purpose. If you ever want to understand fixing instead of replacing, bring it to the workshop. I'll show you how restoration works." Leonard took the bow, feeling its weight settle into his palm with unexpected rightness. "This feels like a test I don't know how to pass." "It's an invitation, not a test," Fiona corrected gently. "Tests have right answers. Invitations just require showing up and being willing to learn something you didn't know before." She turned to leave, but paused after 2 steps, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that was hard to read. "Thank you for releasing her, for believing Nella when belief mattered, for whatever version of justice you delivered that I'll never see details of. Those things matter, even if they don't erase what came before." Leonard nodded once, accepting the gratitude without diminishing it with false modesty or philosophical deflection. "Your daughter is remarkable. Whatever you're teaching her about courage and timing, don't stop." Fiona's departure left silence in her wake, the restaurant's ambient noise flowing back in to fill the space she had occupied. Leonard sat with the bow across his lap, running his fingers along wood that had been destroyed and remade into something functional and beautiful. 3 months passed with the patient inevitability of seasons changing in the mountains. Autumn painted the flatirons in shades of rust and gold, the aspen trees transforming hillsides into cascading color that tourists photographed and locals appreciated with quieter reverence. Lenor's routines continued with their established precision. Meetings at Riva Alta, negotiations in offices where expensive art disguised the nature of transactions, the endless maintenance of empire built on control and calculation. But something had shifted in the foundation, a hairline fracture that didn't weaken the structure, but changed how light moved through it. His lieutenants noticed the change without commenting directly, their observations manifesting in careful questions about priorities and strategic direction. They watched him deflect a confrontation that would normally have escalated to violence, choosing negotiation instead, and wondered if the boss was losing his edge or discovering something sharper. The organization adapted around his subtle transformation, uncertain whether to be concerned or impressed. The bow in his car became a subject of silent speculation among those who drove with him or waited outside meetings. No one asked its significance, because asking would acknowledge they'd noticed, and noticing meant caring about something beyond operational efficiency. But the object accumulated meaning through repetition, becoming a symbol whose interpretation varied depending on who observed it and what they needed to believe about the man who kept it there. Nayla saw him twice more during those months, brief encounters when he arrived at the workshop while she was present. She greeted him with the easy familiarity of someone who had no framework for appropriate distance, asking about his day with genuine interest that assumed his world operated by normal rules. He answered her questions with care, editing reality into something a child could comprehend without nightmares. He drove past the workshop twice before finally parking across the street on a Tuesday afternoon, when rain threatened but hadn't yet arrived. The green door looked freshly painted, a brass sign beside it reading Calvini Restoration, in elegant script that suggested permanence rather than temporary venture. Through the window he could see Fiona bent over a workbench, her concentration absolute as she attended to an instrument spread across padding. The scene looked impossibly peaceful, removed from the violence and calculation that comprised his daily existence. He sat in the car for 17 minutes, the bow resting on the passenger seat beside him, while he wrestled with the unfamiliar sensation of uncertainty. This wasn't negotiation or confrontation. It was something that required vulnerability he had spent decades eliminating from his operational capacity. Finally, he picked up the bow and crossed the street, the bell above the door announcing his entrance with a cheerful brightness that seemed incongruous. Fiona looked up, surprise flickering across her features, before settling into something more complex. Welcome mixed with wariness, curiosity tempered by caution. "I brought it," he said, holding up the bow as if evidence was required. "I don't know what I'm supposed to learn, but I'm here to try." Fiona set down her tools and stood, wiping her hands on her apron with methodical care. "Then we'll start with the basics. Pull up that stool and I'll show you why rushing ruins everything. Why patience is the only tool that actually matters, and how sometimes the best repair is barely visible." Lenore settled onto the wooden stool, feeling absurdly out of place in his tailored suit, among sawdust and instrument cases. But as Fiona began explaining the architecture of sound, the way wood grain influenced resonance, the patience required to restore rather than replace, something unfamiliar happened. He listened, not as strategy or calculation, but as genuine interest in a world that operated by entirely different rules than his own. The afternoon faded into evening, rain finally arriving to tap against the windows, and for those hours he existed outside the empire he had built, learning that fixing was indeed different from replacing. Weeks turned into months, his visits to the workshop becoming irregular but consistent, always bringing questions about technique that really asked about philosophy. Nayla sometimes appeared after school, doing homework in the corner while her mother worked, and this strange man who had once been her rescuer sat learning the language of restoration. The bow eventually hung from his rearview mirror, suspended on its leather loop where it swayed with every turn and stop. He never explained it to anyone who asked, and most knew better than to ask, but it remained there, catching light as he drove through the city, a reminder that some things could be saved if someone with the right skills decided they were worth the effort. One evening, as winter threatened early arrival with frost that turned windows into abstract art, Fiona locked up the workshop and found him waiting by his car. "You've been coming here for months. When are you going to tell me why?" Lenore looked at the bow swaying gently in the cold wind, then back at her. "Because you were right. Some things can't be replaced. They have to be fixed, or they're lost forever. I'm trying to figure out which category I fall into before it's too late to matter." Fiona stepped closer, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You're not an instrument, Lenore. You're a person, and people get to choose whether they want to change, every single day, with every single decision. You showing up here? That's choosing." The simplicity of her statement cut through layers of complexity he had used to justify decades of calculated action. He nodded slowly, accepting wisdom delivered without judgment, offered as gift rather than obligation. They stood in comfortable silence while the city moved around them. Two people from incompatible worlds who had somehow created a space where restoration mattered more than destruction. Above them, the bow swayed in the mirror, balancing perfectly between what was broken and what could still be saved. Thank you all for following this story. If you've been moved by Lenore and Fiona's journey, write in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know where in the world this tale of courage and restoration has reached. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories that matter. Until next time.